Okay, here-
So this is an interview with Laurence Schechtman, longtime Subud member, has a bachelor degree in English literature and a master's degree in sociology. And he lives in Berkeley, California.
yes, indeed.
So Lawrence, can you start out by saying how you found out about Subud and how you came into Subud? What year that was?
There were two people at Columbia, two men, who were at one time or another my roommates. One of them was Wallace Klein, and the other one was Victor Margolin. And alas, they're both now passed. They're both gone. Victor died in Washington, D.C., and Wallace in Honolulu, Hawaii.
Yeah.
And there was one other guy that had been opened about 6 months before them, whose name I now forget, but they were opened and they got me to go down, let me see. It was about 21st Street in Manhattan. And Subud at that time was quite large, and they had a 5-story building that they rented. I'm not
Do you
sure.
remember what year that was?
1962.
62, okay.
Yeah, February. February is when I got opened. And it was wonderful from the beginning. For about 20 minutes, I laughed. I just laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed. And then for the next 10 minutes, I just lay down with my hands astride and felt this gradual current starting in my hands and building up my arms into my body. And that was my opening. And I never had any doubt that this was real.
So how did you get from there to Berkeley?
Well, that's an interesting story. I can tell you that I graduated Columbia in June of '63. And then I had a job doing sociological interviews with teenagers in young 20s. And God, I should tell you that I even had an interview on the day that JFK was shot. And the guy that I interviewed was in jail for some kind of crime. And I remember coming out, and the guards at the jail were so gobsmacked that they even went and told me, if you were here with these kind of people, you'd beat them up too. And I remember, these are my memories of New York. I remember going downstairs and watching the television in a bar, and there was not the slightest doubt about the people doing the announcing. They said the shots came from the grassy knoll. No doubt. Anyway, not too long after that, I had a little bit of a relationship that didn't work out. And I called a friend of mine in Berkeley who was studying sociology there, whom I knew at Columbia. We always used to hang out together in the Hungarian pastry shop. Oh yeah, he was not in Subud. But anyway, I called him, his name was Richard, and he was very shy. And I said, Richard, how you doing in Berkeley? And he said, oh, it's fantastic. I'm going to meetings, I'm going to demonstrations, I'm going to protests. And I said to him, Richard, if Berkeley has done that to you, I'm coming. And so I did. Not too long after that, I got a a ride in a car across the country. Took me a while, didn't take me too long to settle into the politics and also into Subud. And as I said in our letter, at that time in Berkeley, we had about 80 members, and they rented what at that time was a ballet studio, as a matter of fact. And there we were in the ballet studio, first the men and then the women. And San Francisco had about 120. Well, as you know, it's not that way anymore. And there are reasons for that. But still, I loved Subud. It was healing. I remember the time when I had a badly sprained ankle and people had to sort of carry me under the arm into Latihan. And as soon as the Latihan started, bang, it went away and I could walk just fine. So it was very wonderful. And the people in those days were some really extraordinary people. Who was the guy, you must have known him, who was a ship captain?
Ship captain.
A ship's captain. It was a research ship, and he was the captain taking scientists around. And oh, but God, what a wonderful man he was. And there were all kinds of other people that were really and truly wonderful. And I remember in about 66 or 67, in one of the underground newspapers in San Francisco, they predicted that in not too many years, there would be a San Francisco Subud Times.
Subud what?
Times, newspaper.
Oh, a newspaper, yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, of course that never happened, but that was the thing, that so many people were joining. And all of the, you know, I did get a couple of extra people to go into Subud.
Do you remember the names?
God, no, I don't. There's one woman who now lives in LA, whom I brought in. I brought in various girlfriends, you know, who are not in it. Well, no, she is. The one in LA still is, but God, I can't remember her name. Long time ago.
Yeah.
And I brought in the woman that I lived with in Kensington around here, whose name was Ruth Beams, but she didn't stay in very long. And alas, she is now departed. So many people departed. I'm 79 years old. And I guess if I was going to tell you about the very highest point in my Subud life, it was when I was living down in Santa Monica in LA, and Bapap came to a hotel in Santa Monica.
Mm-hmm.
And he gave talks and he did testing. And it was interesting because the men would test by themselves in the middle, but the women would be in chairs around the perimeter, and vice versa. When the women were testing, the men would be around the perimeter. So it was the time, it was the first time that I got to see and hear women doing Latihan. And my God, I thought I was in heaven. They were angels. Oh. But then Bapap did a test. He did several tests, but the one that really got me was, how does it feel to be a good and kind and gentle man? And the first thing that happened to me is that I felt as though my body, my blood vessels, my muscles were all full of molasses, the lower forces. And I went down on my hands and knees and began banging my head on the floor. It was so terrible.
Hmm.
And then gradually, I felt all of that molasses just evaporate away.
Hmm.
And I was clean of it. And I got up, and I stood up, and I felt as though my ribs were opening. The two sides of my ribs were making a clear path towards my heart. And that anybody could say anything to me, and anything could happen to me. And it would just go through the open ribs, through the heart, and out the back. Nothing would affect me. And that was nothing but pure joy. That was the best. I have to say that that was the best experience of my life.
Wow.
No question about it. That experience of being cleansed of all the desires, all the needs, all the lower forces, and just being open to whatever. That was just amazing. But I have to say that at I guess it was sometimes during the 70s, I began to notice something that was in the late 70s, I think, that the helpers were more than you would expect, fairly insane.
Insane.
Insane, yeah. I mean, just insane and not very moral. I mean, I'll give you the first example. When I first realized this, I was living in San Francisco at the time in a one-room hotel near the Panhandle. And there were 3 or 4 other Subud people living in that same hotel.
Mhm.
One night actually, one of the guys who was married, and they were both in Subud, but not for a very long time, the guy came to me and came to another person in the room and said, "My marriage is over. It's gone. We fought too much. I'm going to have to leave. The marriage is dead." And we said to him, "That's okay. All we need for you to do is to do a latihan with us, and that will be okay." And so we did a latihan in our little room, the 3 of us.
Mhm.
And then he went back and made up with his wife and came back and told us, "You saved my marriage."
Hmm.
So the next time we went down to Subud, to the hall, and it was the hall that time that was north of Market Street. I forget what street it is, but it's 1 or 2 blocks over from Van Ness. Remember that place?
It was on California Hall, I believe.
I think that's what it was called, yeah. Anyway, so I told a helper this story. And he said to us, "Don't you ever again dare to do a latihan without a helper present." And that was the last time we saw that couple. They never came back.
Hmm. Yeah.
This is insanity. It's the insanity of petty power. Okay. And then when we moved to the Mission, not California Hall anymore, but it was kind of right on 24th Street near the Mission,
Yeah.
and it was a theatrical and dance hall. Do you remember that one?
Yeah, it was a two-story building with a basement.
Yeah, and right next door, right downstairs, there was a very fine cafe.
That I don't recall. It may have been at a different time. Do you remember the time period that?
This was, I think, in the 80s. Anyway, various things like, once, I like, after I do a lottie hunt, to have a good long quiet period. But across the hall, the helpers wouldn't shut up. They were yakking to each other. Or it may have been the 90s, I think. Anyway, so I said to them, look, gentlemen, there's a really fine cafe downstairs. If you need to chat, go there. And so they did. And it was at that point that somebody then asked me, do I want to be a helper? That I should be a helper more than them. And so in a year or two, I became a helper. But there was another problem there with Abraham Butler. You know Abraham.
Yeah, he's
also
passed away now.
What?
He's passed away now.
Yes, he did, cancer. And Abraham to give you an example, Abraham was a gun nut. He loved, he just believed everybody should have a gun. And I remember one time after Latihan walking downstairs, opening the door and going out into the air. And there was Ibrahim waiting for me, saying, I just wanted to tell you that people who have guns die much less often from guns than those that don't. I'm coming out of the Latihan, And we had a series of meetings. Well, there's another story in the 80s, I should tell you. This, I think, was the 90s. We had a series of meetings among the San Francisco people saying, how can we improve this group? Because we knew there was a lack of harmony. Mm-hmm. And these meetings all ended when it got to the crux of everything, which is that there was nothing that we could do to ask helpers that were creating mayhem to leave, not be helpers anymore. And I'll tell you how that became so firm. Sometime in maybe about 1984, we had, there was a national Congress on the peninsula. I forget which town, maybe San Mateo, I don't know. We had a big building. And also Bapak was going to come there.
Yeah.
And before the meeting, we were all asked to get together little subgroups and talk about any topic that we wanted. Well, I chose the topic, can the local group vote on who should be an active helper there? And the group that I formed was, no question about it, the largest of all the groups that were meeting, 30, 35 people. And we all pretty much agreed, but since Bapak was there, hey, we'd have to ask him. Well, when it came time for me to get up on the stage and report on our committee, they wouldn't let me. Obviously, somebody had heard what we had said and what we had done. And there was this great big guy, used to live down in Santa Cruz, I think, but he was much, much bigger and stronger than me. And as I walked and tried to get to the stairs of the stage, he blocked my path. He would not let me up there and report. Okay. So we finally got together, and at least I went to the BAPOC's translator and said, okay, look, can I at least write a letter to BAPOC and get an answer back that way? So I did. And after a couple of months, I got back a letter again from the translator who said, and I quote, BAPOC says that for the local members to decide who can be a local helper would be a, quote, coup d'etat. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So we couldn't get rid of Abraham and various others. Membership began to decline. I remember when I was back in Berkeley, and so was Abraham, in our little space that was an outbuilding from a church. I brought a guy over to be opened. He went through the 3 months, and then it was his opening day. And then after his opening, we sat around and talked for a little bit. And then I was just with him. And he said to me, who was that crazy guy, Abraham? And he never came back. And we couldn't get rid of Abraham. Years later, they decided, the word got around, and Abraham was promoted to being a helper emeritus.
A helper, what?
Emeritus.
Oh, like a retired helper?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but emeritus has some special, special prestige to it. So I went on, we moved out of there, and it was one of the helper, what's his face? Meldon, who just decided to get into a serious competition with me. Now, we rented our hall, and then after we left, there was another group appointed to come in that was some kind of 12-step group. I don't remember which one. And one day, as we were all sitting in our quiet period, the 12-step group came in early, or at least what we considered early. And I was still in a very deep, quiet space. And as they came in, I just raised the palm of my hand, like so. And they understood and went back out again. But Meldon started to bawl me out. What do you mean, just making a hand sign to those people? And he did it twice, once in the hall, and then when we came out of the hall, once again. Says here my internet connection is unstable. Did you see that?
No, you're still
anyway, I'm still here. Yeah, you're still here. So it went on like that. I mean, it was just like this this competition to the time where one time there was a guy I knew who I wanted very much to get into Subud because he had just spent 1.5 years in jail. He was in bad shape. And the fact that he was in jail, let me put it this way, it wasn't a clean-cut sentence. He had pushed somebody down who had insulted him and driven the car away when he was in the country and depending on the car to get him back home. So anyway, he came out and I wanted to get him into Subud, and we appointed a time for him to come and talk to people, and he didn't show up. And Meldon would just look at me and snarl and say, well, I had a bad feeling about this. And then the ultimate event is when we had moved into the church on College Avenue. I think it was a Lutheran church on College Avenue. The man,
You remember the year of that?
this was when we moved, I'm not sure. It was maybe 15 years ago.
Okay.
But the event that I'm talking about was only about 6 years ago, and this was kind of the ultimate for me. He had a habit. What's his face? I just now forget his name again. Meldon. Yeah. Meldon had this habit when he tested with people of he would ask one question, and then without waiting for very much time, he would ask another question that came from his head alone, or as he might put it, his receiving alone. And then he would ask another, and he would ask 5 or 6 or 7 questions without ever asking the person who was the subject of the testing what sounded good to him. And I told him this was terrible. You know, I mean, the person who's doing the testing should be an equal part of it and should, you know, come up with the question as much as you do. And we even got an answer from a regional helper down in Santa Cruz who said, no, don't do it that way. But it didn't last. In the Lutheran church on College Avenue, he still began doing it again. And I just, you know, while he was in the midst of doing it, and mind you, I was a helper also. I just let him know, this is wrong. And he didn't care. And that was pretty much what did it for me in Subud. I realized the way I can put it is that they violated my most sacred religious principle. And I bet you can't guess what that is.
Freedom?
Democracy.
Yeah.
Close. Very close. Thank you. Anyway, no, I didn't want to put up with it anymore. And there were some other things with other helpers. There was a woman helper that I wanted to talk to, and she said to me, I don't have time for this. Write me an email. So the next time I saw her, I said, I decided to come to Lottie Hunt tonight, but I was thinking maybe I would send it in by email. And she just looked at me sharply and said, I don't like your joke. So I just left, and I haven't been able to make myself go back. I also have to add that considering all the various wars and history in the world, not Ukraine, but most of the other places, they all involve Muslims, and I'm not very fond of Islam. And the way I put it is that it all started, well, let me put it to you this way. It was 300 years between Jesus and Constantine, who made Christianity into a state religion. It was 250 years between the Buddha and the first Buddhist emperor in India. But in terms of Muhammad, the year 1 begins with his Hijra, with his fleeing from you know, at 79, I forget a lot of words. I'm sorry.
Are you talking about Mecca?
From Mecca to Medina, yeah. And as soon as he got to Medina, they basically made him the ruler. And then the empire started to grow. So there was no quiet period, shall we say, between the spiritual leader and the secular leader. It was all melded into one. And when you have secular leadership, government leadership melded into spiritual leadership, there's not much room for any kind of mental freedom because they both push you in the same direction. And that's what I see in Islam. And that's also what I see in Bapak. I'm very grateful for Bapak for having started Subud and for all these magnificent experiences that he gave me. But just as he started Subud, he also killed it. It's not dead altogether, but I don't know of any Subud centers now that are opening young people. Do you?
There are not too many locally, but I think all over the world there are.
Maybe, but certainly not in the United States. Certainly not in all the, I mean, the group in Marin County was huge, was about the same size, 120 people as San Francisco, and it's down to almost nothing. And the younger, I don't know enough about what's going on anywhere else in the world, in Europe or in Africa or whatnot, but certainly around here, it cannot survive without democracy, without being able to avoid having the helpers become petty little kings, which they have tended to do more and more. So I still do the Larihan by myself. What I have done is that I've worked out, without a group, it's a little harder to get started into the Larihan. So I've worked out a series of exercises, physical exercises, to which I do while saying prayers or mantras. See God in everyone you meet. That one happens to come from the Quakers. So I'll do that or Lord, may I be filled with loving kindness. That's 10 syllables. And so I do a lot of exercises to 10. And by the time I'm done with all of those exercises and mantras, it's time for me to do the Larihan. I can't. There are a couple of very close friends of mine, men, whom I've done Larihan with. I guess you might say that, quote, I opened them. I don't know if that's the appropriate term. I haven't, I'm 79 and I've got fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue. So I can't do too much physical activity. My body hurts. It hurts too much when I do this. But I don't think I could go back to Subud. It's been about 5 years now. I don't think I could, especially not to the Berkeley group, with those ridiculous helpers. Maybe if I ever go down to LA, I always did like them down there. I could go there. And some of the helpers down there are very, very good. And I understand that the Portland group is pretty good. But no, I have one friend, a woman, not a girlfriend, who lives in Kentucky now, Henrietta. And I call her up all the time, and she's in Subud. And whenever I talk to her, I really feel the Larihan. But that's the extent of it. And I guess you could say that's my story. I'm trying to think of any other things that I could say. What time is it now? Oh, we've been talking for 40 minutes. That's pretty good.
So do you have any other kind of spiritual type experiences that you had that you can recall?
Well, as I said, the one with Bapak and that testing about being a good, kind, and gentle man is the best of my life. But yes, I've had other experiences that were totally unexpected. Like the time when I was playing basketball at Columbia. And I got into this state that was like a trance, and nobody else, and I couldn't miss the basket, and nobody else could miss the basket. Everybody was shooting, and they were shooting 100%. And eventually I sat down and watched, and they were so fantastic and so beautiful. And then as I walked down into the changing room, I fainted on the stairway. And I got up and I went down and I talked to this guy that was there. And I don't know what I said, but he said to me, "Oh, I see you're a poet too." And there have been times when I've had some very interesting psychic kind of experiences. My favorite one is when I came out of a supermarket. This was in the early 70s. I came out of a supermarket and a guy was panhandling and I gave him $1. Now, mind you, that was a 1970s dollar, which would be maybe 5, 6, or 7 now. I don't know exactly. And then I walked across the street and this guy pulled up in a car and stopped. And it was Max Shear. Max was the guy that started and owned and published the Berkeley Barb. A very well-known person around town. And also he was known for being stingy. I had written a couple of articles. I had been a teacher to his daughter. I knew him fairly well, but he was stingy. One time when I wanted to go out and sell newspapers on the street and you had to pay him for the wholesale price, I didn't have any money. So he said to me, "That's okay, Laurence, just give me your sweater and I'll keep it as collateral." Kind of guy he was. But he stopped the car, he rolled down the window and he said, "Laurence, I don't understand this. I don't know why it is, but something is telling me that I should give you $1. So here." And various things happened like that. There was the time when I was doing Lottie Hahn in the hall, that was the ballet studio. And my Lottie Hahn was very disturbed because the same words kept on coming into my head for about 20 minutes running. And the words were, "You can't come in here. You don't have a warrant." And after about 20 minutes of having that go on in my head, a couple of 100 times, just like that, I didn't go to the door, but somebody else did. And I heard the same words, "You can't come in here. You don't have a warrant." And it was a cop who had heard the noise. And to make things even better, the guy that went to the door said, "Well, where's Subud?" And the cop said, this is an amazing Berkeley cop quote, he said, "Oh yeah, Subud, I know about you. My hobby is comparative religions." So things like that would happen.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is a strange one, and it's hard to tell. Because it was the morning that I was supposed to catch a plane and go down to LA and meet my brother there. And my mother had been on breathing support for 2 months. And this was about 1990. And in those days, they weren't so good at following your last instructions. She had written that she didn't want any of that extra care to keep her alive. But after 2 months, the doctors decided that they would let her off. And before I went to the airplane, I was walking with my girlfriend in what is known as Cesar Chavez Park by the bay. And I saw something that I've never seen before or since. I saw two big dogs, very big dogs, chasing a rabbit. And they chased and they chased, and the rabbit was always in front of them. And finally, after about 5 minutes of this, the rabbit got to a hole and went down in the hole and disappeared. And the two dogs were totally bewildered. What happened to the rabbit? And then I went down to LA to my mother's hospital, and me and my brother stood by her bed after she had been disconnected from the breathing apparatus and slowly went away. Things like that happen. Strange, incidental things, you know, that I relate very much to Subud. And frankly, I once, back in the year 99, I started a separate Larihan group here in Berkeley. But it couldn't have possibly worked because we only had one room and we had a married couple there that insisted on doing Larihan together. And that's one thing that Bapak says that I can assure you is absolutely correct. Don't do it. I mean, there was one woman who was so scared by us loud men that she would go into Larihan and she would always manage to hide in a closet. And then there was this very, very beautiful woman who had come to us. She had been in Indonesia, so she was open. And there was myself and another man in the group that were both in competition for her. This is not so good. There were the times when men would make masculine kinds of sounds that would really freak the women out. Not good. So thank you, Bapak, for that. And there's only one way that you know when a rule is true for certain. You know what that is? It's when you break it.
When you, what?
When you break the rule and you see what happens.
Oh, I see, yeah.
So, although it's interesting, now that there's a breakaway group, I understand now, in Hawaii.
I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, there is, and I would very much like to visit them, but they also do Larihan, men and women together, which I think. But the thing is that even in Hawaii, the group, you know, before they formed this other group, it diminished quite a bit. So in my dream of dreams, if I get a new car that can get around, because the car that I have right now breathes exhaust into my face, I would like to start a new Larihan group. And I even have a potential name for it. I would call it Release and Receive, which are, after all, the two things we do in Larihan. We let go of all the crap and we pull in all the light. So release and receive. And hopefully I can be democratic enough, even though I'd be starting it, that we wouldn't have all of these problems. God, what else? I remember when I was open back in '62 in New York, after that first 20 minutes of laughing and then lying on the ground, the next couple of Ladihans, I was just on the ground feeling this electricity. And then eventually I stood up. Oh yeah, I want to tell you something else, indicating what can be the power of testing. Back in the 90s, we had a test in Berkeley, and the test was, what are you good for? What are you going to make of your life? And somebody got a strong receiving from me that my future would be in gardening, which was totally preposterous because I'm a New York City kid. I grew up with the sidewalks everywhere. And then I came to Berkeley and was never very much of a country style, and I never learned how to garden. But then in the 21st century, I formed a political party for Berkeley called the Berkeley Progressive Alliance. And there were some major mistakes in that. So even though we had a lot of people come to the first meeting to what do you call, to come on, to anoint, to get some people to run. What's the word? When you appoint people to run in the general election, nominate. Okay, sorry. You get some, and it didn't work. They nominated a woman for mayor who was just bloody god awful. So I couldn't do that kind of politics anymore. And the next thing I did was that I became an organizer of gardeners. And we called it Neighborhood Vegetables. The slogan being, anybody can be a neighborhood vegetable. And we just got people in the neighborhood that would come over and help somebody start a garden or continue a garden, mostly food gardens. And we generally did it twice a week, Saturday and Sunday. The rest of my week was involved with getting people that wanted to have their garden helped with, and then getting people, altogether I got about 3,000 people online that I could send a message to. And I did that for about 3 years. And it was all preceded by this test in the 90s that you would have a career in gardening. Very strange, but very wonderful. Oh, I could tell you something else. There was a movie, a French-made movie called Phantom India. And it was 6 hours long in 6 one-hour segments. And I remember in the spiritual segment, there was a woman who was kneeling down in a temple who, as far as I could tell, was doing a Ladihan. It was exactly the same. And I just looked at that, there was somebody with me and I said, no, they're not supposed to show that. But that's what it was. And there is, in fact, a tradition within Hinduism that is called Shakti. Have you heard that?
I've heard the word, but I don't know what it means.
Shakti, where you simply receive the power and let it move your body. In other words, it's basically a Ladihan. And of course, other instances of that with the original Quakers. Starting in about 1650, they would be moving around and singing. And in fact, what Bapak once said about them is that they were doing the Latihan, but then they started mixing sexes. They had women and men together, and that kind of stopped it. So there are many things like Subud. It's not unique. It is a force that is here, and various people have occasioned upon it, just like the original Christians in the first century, when they were when they received to speak in all these languages, speaking in tongues. And there was an interesting case in the beginning of the 20th century. There were some people in Armenia who received that they better leave Armenia because there was going to be, as there was, this great massacre, this genocide of the Armenians in the First World War. So they left and they came here. And they mostly went, a lot of them went to LA. And once they got to LA, they started speaking in tongues, which is the origin of the what do you call, the fundamentalist Christians who speak in tongues. But it started from these Armenians. And they were so sure from the New Testament that they were speaking various languages that they sent out people to go all over the world and receive the tongue that they thought that they were speaking and see if the people there would understand it in all these foreign lands, which of course they did not. And so they had to come back here and say, oh, they didn't understand us. Something else was happening.
Yeah.
So I just absolutely love the Latihan. There is nothing better. There's nothing better. When I'm procrastinating and can't get things done, if I do a Latihan, after the Latihan, I can do whatever is needed. I don't know if you've had anything like that kind of experience, because you may not be a procrastinator, I don't know.
Yeah.
But things just start happening right when you come out of the Latihan.
Yeah.
But there is all those attachments to it that in the group that I can't deal with.
Well, thank you. It's been a good talk.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
I'll keep putting stuff on Facebook and you can keep liking it and writing back.
Okay. The last thing I have to ask is if you agree to have me put it on YouTube for other people to look at this video.
Yes, I very much want them to know what, you say that I'm the only one that you've spoken to who has left the group, and why. I think that should get around. And in fact, I'll make a deal with you. All right?
Mm-hmm.
You put it on whatever media you want to put it on. But in exchange, I want you to tell me what people say.
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay, Rutman. I really appreciate everything that you're doing. I'm glad that you're doing this. So it's off now?
No, it's still on. So I'm turning it off now.
Okay, once it goes off, I won't see or hear you anymore, right?
No, No, we can still talk.
Oh, we can still talk, but it just won't be recorded.